So, as we get to DNA, it is one of the foundations of biology, and it's given a really fancy name, deoxyribonucleic acid. You don't need to remember that name. Um, More important about what DNA does. And DNA is a carrier of our genetic information. And when I talk about genetic information, it's what makes you you and what makes me me. It's our genes. And if you remember, we have alleles, which are different versions of the gene. So we kept it very simple. So we said things like, can you bend your thumb or not? So you have a gene for thumb bending. One version is you can't, and one version is you can. Uh, Things like attached earlobes. You have a gene for earlobes. There is a unattached version where it's not stuck to the side of your face, and one where it is. Um, the gene for widow's peak. You have a version where you do have one, and there's a version where you don't. And so these are our traits. So these are the things that make us us. And one thing that I want to refer back to are chromosomes. So we've talked about chromosomes when we talked about mitosis. Those are made up of DNA. The DNA, there's a lot of it, it's been wound up very tightly into these chromosomes. And so if we go way back to when we talked about organelles, we have the nucleus here. And inside the nucleus, there's things like the nucleolus, which makes the ribosomes. But also floating in there is our genetic information, our DNA. And it never leaves there. Each of our cells, cheek cells, skin cells, liver cells, heart cells, they all have the same genetic information, which is incredible. So each of our cells has a library of who we are, which is pretty cool. Um, DNA is wound up in a what we call a double helix. It looks like a ladder, and if you unwind it, sorry about that. If you unwind it, you can see that it kind of does look like a ladder. There's two things on the side, and then there's like these little lines in between, and so those two lines on the side we call the sugar phosphate backbone. We'll get to that in a little bit. But on the inside are these things called base pairs. Right now, to you, they look like letters, but really, it's like an alphabet. You know that there are 26 letters in our alphabet, and with those 26 letters, you can create massive books. You can create poems and stories just off of these 26 letters. Well, DNA is similar to that, but instead of having 26 letters, there's only 4 letters. And those 4 letters create who we are. So they write a story about who we are. Okay, do we have a widow's peak? Do we have an attached or unattached earlobe? Can we bend our thumb? Can we not bend our thumb? So think about it like this. I had you'll get this Pear Deck question at some point, but it's like a recipe. So think about a recipe online. Normally, when you want a recipe online, you just look for the recipe that you want. You don't have to go to the website and make all the food on their website just to make some chocolate chip cookies, just to make a cake, just to make, a taco or a salad. You just go find the little piece that you need. And so DNA is going to be very similar in that way. So when our cheek cell needs to create something it needs, it doesn't make the entire DNA sequence. It only uses what it needs. And so we'll get to like, well, what is it making? So what is it making? Eventually we're going to talk about proteins, but that comes a little bit later. And so there's this question. Again, it's a very simple question. People are like, nobody would be that stupid. Nobody would make the entire website just to create chocolate chip cookies or the cake that they wanted or the favorite dish that they wanted. They're only going to go look for the recipe that they need and create that one recipe. So DNA is similar in that way. So DNA is, I always put this in quotations, quote unquote, discovered by Watson and Crick in the 1950s, 1953 to be exact, and they give it the name the double helix. The reason I say that it was, quote unquote, discovered by them, because really they couldn't have done the work without Rosalind Franklin. So Rosalind Franklin takes a photo and it's given to Watson. Watson takes a look at it because Watson and Crick were lost. They did not have the structure of DNA down. And it was this picture that gave them the clue the final clue that they needed. If they didn't have this picture of DNA, they wouldn't have gotten it, or maybe it would have taken them twice as long to get the structure of DNA down. The sad part is they never gave her credit. They never gave her credit for her work. And unfortunately, she dies early, and Watson and Crick earn a Nobel Prize for their quote unquote discovery of DNA, and she doesn't share in that discovery. It's not until much later on that some people give her credit, but by then it's kind of a little too late because she had passed away. So you're going to sketch something that looks like this one right here. So just sketch something that looks like a ladder, basically, with some letters in between. That's all. DNA, like we talked before, is found inside the nucleus. DNA is usually tightly coiled into these chromosomes. And so this is, again, just picturing a cell, nucleus, chromosome inside the nucleus. Chromosome is made up of DNA, and then DNA is made up of those little ladders, those little letters. Just a recap of chromosomes. Again, you get 23 from your mom, 23 from your dad, 46 makes you. You have 23 pairs. So like this is right here, this is pair 1, this is pair 2, this is pair 3, all the way down to pair number 23. Okay. But if you were to count individuals, because it's like a pair of shoes, so like you can say, I have 1 pair of shoes, but I've asked you how many shoes do you have? Well, I have a left one and a right one, 2. You can extract DNA, and we did this in a pivot lab. You can extract it from strawberries, but you could actually do this from your cheek cells too. So you can scrape your cheek cells, put it in a little bit of soapy water, pour some alcohol over that, and then you can actually pull your DNA out of your cheek cells. Can't do anything with it, but you could at least see it. So this ladder of DNA, it's made out of what we call a repeating subunit. Think like Legos. Again, biology is really about these Lego pieces. So taking things apart and putting them back together. But we have a repeating unit called a nucleotide. And so I'll explain it like in terms of a ladder here. Before I do, the nucleotide is made up of 3 pieces. So it's made up of the phosphate, which connects sugars together. It's made up of a sugar, which is going to hold the bases. And then it has the bases, which are the letters, and that's your genetic information. So to make it a little bit easier, it looks like this. So there's a space in your notebook to do this drawing. Okay, so you have this phosphate, the sugar, and the base. Now, if we like zoom out a little bit, we'll notice again that ladder structure. So the sides are the sugar phosphate, and the part in between are the bases. So think like the part you step on the ladder, those are the bases. And then the sides of the ladder, that's the sugar phosphate backbone. One of the things that I asked you on this pear deck, like, what do you notice about the 2 sides? You'll notice that one of them is flipped the other way. Like I can't rotate my wrist like that, but so instead of being, maybe use a pen. So instead of the pens being like this, one is opposite like this, but they're still right across from each other. So here, just making sure, like I said, you know what the phosphate, the sugar, and the base part are. So those letters, which 4 letters are we working with? We're working with adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Now, you don't need to know those names. If you understand A pairs with T and G pairs with C, you're fine. So a way I remember it, you may remember it differently, but if you look, the ones that are curved pair together. So C will pair up with G all the time. The ones that are straight lines pair up with each other. So A pairs up with T. So when you look at that ladder, let me go backwards. If you look at this ladder, see A is across from T, or T is across from A. G is across from C, or C is across from G, however you look at it. Okay. That's how they pair up across from each other. And so in class, we're going to have some practice. So like if I put A, T, T, C, then paired up would be T, A, A, G. Now, I did talk about this in class. Some people, and I'll put it on the screen right now. Some people have a bit of a hard time with this one. Some people look at it up and down, and some people look at it side to side. So I'm going to show you what I mean right now. So A, T, T, C, and A, T, T, C. However you look at it, is fine. Just like I said, just get used to whatever style you're looking at. So if I have a piece of DNA, okay, so remember, you have one side of the ladder and it's connected to the other. So if I say, well, what does A pair with? Well, A pairs with T. T pairs with A. T pairs with A. C pairs with G. Personally, this is how I like to do it. Some people, because they still think ladder, so like steps of a ladder like this, still the same thing. A across from it would be T. Across from T would be A. Across from T would be A. And across from C would be G. Like that. So again, it doesn't matter which way you look at it. Both of them end up being the same thing. And pop back over to this. So we'll get some practice with these here. And then draw this inside of your notebook somewhere. So what is the purpose of DNA? Well, DNA are recipes, or like a recipe book or a recipe website. And when we talk about genes, the gene for your earlobe, the gene for thumb bending, the gene for widow's peak, that's what sections of DNA are. They're like, it's a recipe for widow's peak. It's a recipe for your thumb bending or not. It's a recipe for your earlobe. It's a recipe for your eye color. It's a recipe for your skin color. And so just like this gigantic recipe book, you can pull out a recipe for cookies. Your DNA is really long. It codes for who you are. And you can pull out a recipe for collagen protein. You can pull out a recipe for melanin, which is going to be your skin color. At the end of the day, DNA really is a recipe book for making proteins. So you're primarily made up of water. That's why you're squishy. Some of the harder parts of you, some of the thicker, meaty parts of you are made out of proteins. And those proteins, like I said, biology is like Legos. Proteins are made up of amino acids. So this is where it gets a little confusing, okay? But if you put amino acids together, you can make really big proteins. And the question is, well, what are amino acids made out of? Okay, we'll kind of get to that in a little bit. What are some examples of proteins? Because then it's like, okay, well, great, DNA makes proteins, and what? Well, if you ever wondered, like, where does your hair come from? Where does your nail, like, where does this come from? Well, there are cells near the tips of your fingertips. There are cells inside of the little hair follicles that make these proteins. Well, how do they know how to make them? Your DNA is the recipe book for your hair. It's the recipe for fingernails. So there's a recipe for your fingernail protein. There's a recipe for something called pepsin, which is going to help in your digestion. There's a recipe for antibodies. There's a recipe for your cell membrane proteins. And we talked about these like integral proteins, peripheral proteins. There's a recipe for things like insulin, some of your hormones. So that's what DNA is doing. It's creating all these recipes that make you who you are. So proteins, again, are made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of amino acids. Another way to think about this is like amino acids are ingredients and proteins are the meal. You can have a set of ingredients like eggs, tomatoes, bacon, salt, pepper. And with just those couple things, you can make different meals. Like you can make just boiled eggs. That's one meal. You could make scrambled eggs. That's another meal. You can make eggs and bacon. You can make just bacon and pepper. You could make bacon and tomatoes, or you can make eggs and tomatoes. Like just with those 5 ingredients, you have the ability to make a bunch of different types of meals. And that's the same thing with amino acids. They're just ingredients. And if you put them in different combinations, they'll create different proteins for you. Now, this is an old school chart on how to figure out amino acids. I'm going to give you a simpler version. Basically, we're going to use a website. It's much faster. It does the same thing. Some people don't like it. They're like, well, you should teach them how to use it. It's like, they're going to end up with the same answer. You're going to end up with the same answer. So these are like the 20 amino acids. So, all the way above here, you don't need to remember any of these structures. You don't even need to remember the amino acid names, okay? The main point here, listen, the main point you need to take away from this is DNA is a code for amino acids. So basically, it's a code book for amino acids. You put different amino acids together, and they make proteins. And those proteins make you who you are. So that's just like the basics of DNA. So in terms of amino acids, we're going to code for them with 3 letters. So every 3 letters, AAA, GCG, TAT, any combo that you come up with is what we call a codon. So every 3 letters is a codon, and it codes for a particular amino acid. So if you remember way back when, we talked about ribosomes. And we said, hey, ribosomes are responsible for making proteins. So there are cells near the tips of your fingernails. And in those cells, those ribosomes are making the protein for your fingernail. But DNA doesn't leave the nucleus, and the ribosomes are outside of the nucleus. So how does it get the instructions there? So we'll talk about that in just a bit. But DNA, like I said, is the code, and ribosome is the cook. Okay, so they're going to be cooking up the proteins. DNA is going to live 2 lives. So one is replication and one is making proteins. So I'm going to end this portion here because it's gotten kind of long. And plus, I think I need to change some things in class. I think I need to cross some things out in the notes, and we'll see about that. But we'll end off here. 1, DNA, its first life is replication. It's responsible for making more copies of itself. If you remember back to mitosis. So mitosis, you have to create an identical copy. We have 46 chromosomes. If you remember way back in mitosis, we have to change that to 92. So at one point in our cells, there's 92 chromosomes. And then the cell splits in half. 46 go to this one, 46 go to this one. You have 2 new identical cells. Then if you look at this cell, okay, at some point it's going to grow up. It's time to divide those 46. It's going to turn into 96, okay, or 92. And then it splits 46 and 46. And then this cell grows up. And it just keeps going through that replication cycle. The other one is making proteins. So that's the other life of DNA. And later on during class, I'll probably show you how to use this website right here, DNA to RNA. Super simple. You just type in the DNA code. It gives you the mRNA code. And then it gives you the amino acid code. Super simple to use.